Amina Johnson stood outside the small, weather-beaten clinic, her breath shallow and fingers trembling slightly as she clutched her throbbing wrist. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, but the pain in her wrist was a persistent reminder that this was not a day for rest. Her soccer practice the day before had gone well, until she took a sudden fall and landed hard on her wrist. The sharp, immediate pain that followed told her something was wrong, but with her busy schedule, she'd waited an entire day before deciding to see a doctor. Taking a deep breath, Amina stepped inside the clinic. The small waiting room was nearly empty, save for a few chairs, an old coffee table cluttered with outdated magazines, and a receptionist desk where a young woman was sitting. Amina walked toward the desk, her heart beating with the discomfort she often felt in predominantly white spaces. She couldn't help but notice the receptionist's eyes flicker up briefly, then drop back to her phone as if Amina's presence had gone unnoticed. The receptionist, Sarah Miller, was a blonde woman in her late 20s, chatting animatedly on her phone, her voice echoing through the room. "Oh my God, Lisa, you won't believe it. He finally asked me out." "I know, right? I was so surprised. Hold on, let me check on something." Amina hesitated, her wrist still throbbing. "Excuse me," she said softly, trying to catch Sarah's attention. "My wrist, it's really hurting. I need to see a doctor." Sarah didn't lift her head, her hand still holding the phone to her ear. "You're going to have to wait like everyone else," she said, her tone sharp, dismissive. "Grab a seat. I'll get to you when I get to you." Amina's face tightened, but she didn't argue. She was no stranger to being brushed off, but this was a medical clinic. She expected more professionalism, even if only the bare minimum of courtesy. She took a seat in the corner, her wrist throbbing even more now, as if the pain fed on the frustration building in her chest. As the minutes passed, she watched Sarah laugh, talking about her date night plans without acknowledging her or the other patients in the room. An elderly white man came in a few minutes later. He was slow in his movements, and his face showed years of hardship. Amina watched carefully, her frustration mounting as Sarah's behavior shifted immediately. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" Sarah's tone was sweet, almost caring, and she immediately began typing into her computer. Amina clenched her fist, feeling the sting of being invisible. She tried to shake off the familiar weight of discrimination pressing on her chest, but it was hard to ignore the stark contrast in how Sarah treated the white man versus herself. She watched as the man was led back to see the doctor without any delays. What had she done wrong? Was it her appearance? Was it because she didn't belong in the same way others did? Her mind raced back to similar moments in her life, where she was treated as lesser, where her needs and her voice were dismissed simply because of the color of her skin. She had worked hard to overcome those moments, but they never really left. And now, here in this clinic, she was reminded yet again that no matter how educated, well-spoken, or calm she tried to be, some people would never see her as anything more than an inconvenience. More time passed. Amina glanced at her phone. She had been waiting for over 40 minutes. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, she approached the receptionist's desk again. "Excuse me," Amina said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been waiting a long time. My wrist is really hurting." Sarah rolled her eyes and glanced up lazily. "I told you you'll have to wait. You're not the only one here." Amina swallowed hard. "But you've let 2 other patients in before me, and I was here first." Sarah scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Look, you're going to have to be patient. You people always think you're entitled to everything. Wait your turn." Amina froze. Her heart pounded in her ears and her breath caught in her throat. "What did you just say?" Sarah shrugged, looking indifferent. "I said wait your turn. Now, unless you want to fill out some more paperwork, just sit down and stop making a scene." The words hit Amina like a slap. She had been careful not to raise her voice, to remain composed, but the casual cruelty in Sarah's words left her reeling. You people, she had heard those words before, always filled with disdain, always meant to belittle and diminish. Her wrist throbbed, but the pain in her chest was worse. She didn't want to give Sarah the satisfaction of seeing her react, but the anger was building. How many more times would she have to swallow this kind of treatment? How many more times would she be dismissed and disrespected simply because of the color of her skin? Her mind raced with what to do next. Should she demand to see a manager? Should she leave and find another clinic? She knew she had every right to be angry, but she also knew how this would play out if she wasn't careful. If she raised her voice or showed her frustration, she would be labeled the angry black woman, and Sarah would likely play the victim. Amina had seen it happen before. Still, her wrist hurt too much for her to leave. She needed to be seen, but the idea of sitting in that waiting room any longer made her stomach turn. She turned back to Sarah, who was now typing something on her computer, ignoring her once again. Amina was about to say something, but just then, the door to the clinic opened, and Dr. Taylor, the head physician, walked in. Dr. Taylor, a tall, stern-looking woman in her 40s, immediately sensed the tension in the room. She had overheard part of the conversation between Sarah and Amina. Her sharp eyes moved between the two women, noticing the way Sarah's face stiffened when she saw her. "Is everything all right here?" Dr. Taylor asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Sarah quickly put on a professional smile. "Yes, everything's fine, doctor. Just dealing with some patients." Amina, seeing an opportunity, spoke up. "Actually, no, it's not fine. I've been waiting for over an hour, and I've watched other patients who arrived after me go in, and I think I know why." Dr. Taylor looked at Amina, then at Sarah, her expression hardening. "How long has this woman been waiting?" Sarah hesitated, her smile faltering. "I'm not sure, maybe 15-20 minutes. Amina shook her head. "That's not true. I've been here for over an hour, and she hasn't once checked on me. Instead, she's been letting others go ahead." Dr. Taylor's eyes narrowed as she looked at Sarah. "Is this true?" Sarah stammered, I didn't think it was a big deal, doctor. I mean, look at her, she probably can't even afford the deductible for an x-ray. I was just trying to save time." Dr. Taylor's face darkened. "That is not your decision to make. We treat all patients equally in this clinic, regardless of what you think they can afford. You know that. And using a patient's appearance to decide who gets seen first, that's unacceptable." Sarah's eyes widened in panic. "But doctor, I didn't mean." "I don't want to hear it," Dr. Taylor interrupted, her voice cold and unyielding. "You are relieved of your duties. Leave now and don't come back." Sarah blinked in disbelief, her face turning pale. "What? You heard me. You're fired. This clinic has no room for prejudice, and your actions today were beyond unacceptable. Now leave, or I'll have security escort you out." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but Dr. Taylor was unmoved. Amina watched in stunned silence as Sarah gathered her things and hurried out the door, her head down in shame. Dr. Taylor turned to Amina, her expression softening. "I am so sorry for what happened today. Please, let's get you taken care of. You shouldn't have had to go through that." Amina nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dr. Taylor led Amina into the examination room, where she could finally get the care she needed. But even as the doctor examined her wrist, Amina couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one small victory in a much larger battle. The midday sun hung high in the sky as Amina Johnson stepped into the clinic, clutching her wrist in pain. It had been a long day at work, made worse by the fall she took during her lunch break. Her wrist throbbed with every movement, a sharp reminder of her injury. She had hoped to be seen quickly, given that the clinic wasn't too busy that afternoon. But the moment she walked through the door, she was met with something far worse than her physical pain: the cold indifference of the receptionist, Sarah Miller. Sarah sat behind the front desk, barely looking up from her computer as Amina approached. A few feet away, Mr. Patel, a middle-aged man of Indian descent, was being handed his paperwork by Sarah with a smile. "There you go, Mr. Patel. You're all set for today. Dr. Taylor will see you shortly," Sarah said, her tone warm and professional. Amina waited, holding her wrist with her good hand, feeling the discomfort not only from her injury, but from the dismissive air that lingered in the room. She cleared her throat gently, hoping to catch Sarah's attention. Without looking up, Sarah continued typing, her fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard. "I'll be with you in a moment," she muttered, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth or acknowledgement. Amina's discomfort deepened. She had been here before, and it wasn't just the physical spaces that felt familiar, it was the unspoken judgment in Sarah's tone. She had experienced it too many times before, the subtle insinuations, the second glances, the unspoken question, "Why are you here?" It wasn't always overt, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to manifest in the smallest of actions. Finally, Sarah looked up, her eyes scanning Amina quickly, almost as if she were assessing whether or not Amina truly belonged in this clean, orderly clinic. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone still neutral, though it carried a faint edge. "No, I don't. I hurt my wrist earlier today, and it's been getting worse. I was hoping to see someone about it," Amina replied, her voice steady despite the discomfort she felt. Sarah sighed, as if this request was an inconvenience. She glanced at her computer screen, clicking through a few windows before looking back at Amina. "Do you have insurance?" "Yes, I do," Amina said, reaching into her bag for her wallet. She handed Sarah her insurance card, but as Sarah took it, her fingers brushed against Amina's for a brief moment. A flicker of something passed across Sarah's face, something that Amina had seen too many times: judgment, dismissal, a sense of superiority. Sarah glanced at the card briefly before sliding it back across the counter. "Let me just run this and see what you're covered for." As Sarah typed away on her computer, Amina couldn't help but notice the difference in the way she had been treated compared to Mr. Patel. He had been greeted with a smile, a sense of professionalism that was noticeably absent in Sarah's interactions with her. Amina's heart sank as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just about her being a walk-in patient. This was about something far deeper, something she had no control over: the color of her skin. It wasn't long before Sarah turned back to her with a tight smile. "Well, it looks like your insurance is valid," she said, the surprise in her voice poorly concealed. "But your deductible is quite high, $500. Will you be able to afford that?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell, and Amina felt her chest tighten. She had heard this kind of insinuation before, this thinly veiled assumption that because she was black, she might not have the means to pay for her medical care. It was a question Sarah hadn't asked Mr. Patel. It was a question that didn't need to be asked at all. "Yes, I can afford it," Amina replied firmly, meeting Sarah's gaze head-on. "I have insurance, and I'll cover whatever is necessary." Sarah's eyebrows arched slightly, as if surprised by Amina's confidence. "Well, all right then. Go ahead and have a seat, and I'll let you know when the doctor can see you." Amina turned and found a chair in the waiting room, her wrist still throbbing, though now her mind was focused on something else entirely. She watched as Mr. Patel was called back almost immediately, his care expedited with efficiency and warmth. Meanwhile, she sat, waiting, trying to ignore the burning sensation in her chest. It wasn't just her wrist that ached now, it was the sting of yet another subtle act of discrimination, of being made to feel less than, simply because of her skin color. Amina looked around the room, noticing how patients of different backgrounds came and went with ease. Sarah's interactions with them were always polite, always efficient, but when it came to Amina, there was a noticeable change in demeanor. It was like a switch had been flipped, and suddenly Amina wasn't just another patient, she was an inconvenience, a burden to be dealt with. Time passed, and Amina's patience wore thin. She had been sitting in the waiting room for over an hour now, and still, there was no sign that she would be seen anytime soon. She watched as Sarah continued to call other patients, all of whom seemed to move through the clinic with ease, while Amina remained stuck in her chair, ignored. Finally, Amina had had enough. She approached the front desk again, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Excuse me, I've been waiting for over an hour now, and my wrist is really starting to hurt. Can you please check when I'll be seen?" Sarah looked up from her computer, her expression one of mild annoyance. "You'll be seen when the doctor is ready. You're not the only patient here, you know." "I understand that," Amina replied, her voice still calm but firm. but I've noticed that other patients who came in after me have already been seen. I just want to make sure I haven't been overlooked." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, and Amina could feel the tension building between them. "Like I said, you'll be seen when it's your turn," Sarah repeated, her tone cold. Amina took a deep breath, realizing that this conversation wasn't going to get her anywhere. She returned to her seat, feeling the weight of Sarah's judgment pressing down on her. It wasn't just about waiting, it was about being made to feel invisible, unimportant, and less worthy of care than the other patients. As she sat there, her mind wandered back to all the other times she had experienced something similar. The subtle comments, the dismissive looks, the way people seemed to assume things about her without even knowing her. It was exhausting, carrying the weight of other people's prejudices on top of everything else. Just when Amina thought she might never be seen, the door to the clinic opened and Dr. Taylor appeared. He was a tall, kind-looking man with a calm demeanor. He glanced around the room before spotting Amina. "Amina Johnson," he called out, his voice gentle. Amina stood, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She approached Dr. Taylor, grateful that her ordeal in the waiting room was finally coming to an end. "Sorry for the wait," Dr. Taylor said as he led her to the examination room. "We've been a bit backed up today." Amina nodded, though she knew the real reason for her long wait had little to do with the clinic being busy. She followed Dr. Taylor into the room, eager to finally get some relief for her wrist. But as she sat down on the examination table, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her wrist. It was about something much bigger, something that had been festering in the background all afternoon. And as Dr. Taylor began to examine her injury, Amina couldn't help but wonder if he knew about the way Sarah had treated her, or if he would do anything about it if he did. The visit continued, Dr. Taylor professionally and compassionately tending to Amina's wrist. He ordered an X-ray and assured her that they would get to the bottom of the issue. But as Amina left the clinic that day, with her wrist now properly cared for, she couldn't forget Sarah's words, her tone, or the way she had been made to feel like less than human. And she knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be the last time she'd face something like this. The clinic waiting room was small, with dull, beige walls and a few faded motivational posters. The air conditioner hummed softly, its cool breeze offering little relief to the quiet frustration simmering beneath the surface. Amina Johnson sat in one of the cheap plastic chairs, her wrist throbbing from the fall she had suffered the day before. She tried to shift her position, cradling her injured arm gently, but the dull ache was constant, radiating up through her elbow. It had been over 3 hours since she walked into the clinic, and while other patients came and went, she remained seated, watching as the clock ticked on. Across the room, Sarah Miller, the white receptionist, sat behind her desk. She appeared engrossed in a phone conversation, her voice occasionally rising in excitement as she gossiped with a friend about a new restaurant she had visited the previous night. The conversation felt out of place in the sterile environment, especially with Amina waiting so long for help. From time to time, Amina would glance at the reception desk, hoping for acknowledgement, but each time Sarah would either ignore her completely or offer a fleeting, dismissive glance. Amina took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She was used to this being overlooked, ignored, made to feel invisible. It was a familiar feeling, one she had encountered too many times in similar settings. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, feeling the prick of frustration rising in her chest. She didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to confirm whatever assumptions Sarah might have made about her the moment she walked in, but the pain was becoming unbearable, and her patience was wearing thin. "Excuse me," Amina said, standing up and walking slowly towards the reception desk, her voice tentative yet firm. "I've been waiting for quite a while now. My wrist is really hurting. Could you tell me how much longer it'll be?" Sarah glanced up briefly from her phone, her expression one of mild annoyance. She barely registered Amina's presence before returning her attention to her screen. "You'll just have to wait like everyone else," she said, her tone clipped. "We'll get to you when we get to you." Amina felt the sting of the words, a familiar burn of rejection. She wanted to say something, to push back, but instead she simply nodded and turned away, returning to her seat. She knew what Sarah was thinking, even if the receptionist hadn't said it outright. People like Amina were always made to wait, always pushed to the back of the line, ignored until there was no other choice. The minutes stretched on, and Amina found herself watching as another patient, an older white man named Mr. Patel, was called in to see the doctor. He hadn't been waiting long, maybe 20 minutes at most. Sarah greeted him with a smile and a friendly tone, her demeanor shifting completely as she handed him the paperwork. Amina bit her lip, forcing herself not to react. She could feel the tension building inside her, the frustration mixing with the pain in her wrist. She wanted to be seen, to be treated like everyone else in the room. But no matter how many times she had experienced moments like this, it never got any easier. Meanwhile, Dr. Taylor, the clinic's head physician, finished up with Mr. Patel in one of the examination rooms. He was a seasoned doctor, known for his thoroughness and dedication to his patients. After giving Mr. Patel the all clear and handing him his next prescription, Dr. Taylor headed back to the front desk, expecting Sarah to have the next patient ready. Sarah, Dr. Taylor called out as he approached the desk, scanning the clipboard in his hand. "Who's next?" Sarah barely looked up from her phone, still deep in conversation with her friend. "Oh, there's no rush, doctor. I think we've only got one patient left. She just got here," she said dismissively, her voice airy, as if the information held no real importance. Dr. Taylor frowned, glancing at the empty chairs in the waiting room. Only Amina remained, sitting quietly with her injured wrist cradled in her lap. He glanced back at the clock and then back to Sarah. "She just got here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I've been back there for over an hour, and I don't remember seeing anyone else come in." Sarah shrugged, clearly uninterested. "Yeah, she's only been waiting for like 15 minutes. No big deal," she said, her tone indifferent. Amina's head jerked up at Sarah's words. She had been here for hours, watching patients come and go while she remained invisible. She had been patient, hoping someone would notice her, but this was too much. Rising to her feet, she stepped toward the front desk once again, her voice wavering between anger and exhaustion. "Excuse me, but that's not true," Amina said, her voice more forceful this time. "I've been here for over 3 hours, and I'm in a lot of pain. I don't know why you keep saying I just got here." Sarah's face flushed slightly, but she didn't back down. "I think you're mistaken," she said coolly, folding her arms across her chest. "There's no way you've been here that long." Dr. Taylor's frown deepened as he glanced between the two women. Something was clearly off. He turned to Amina, his voice soft but concerned. "You've really been waiting that long?" Amina nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and hurt. "Yes, doctor. I've been here since 2 p.m. I don't know why she's ignoring me." Dr. Taylor's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Sarah, who was now avoiding his gaze. He didn't need to hear any more, he could already see the situation for what it was. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm and unyielding, "why wasn't she called in earlier?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, fumbling for an excuse. "Well, you know, I just thought. I mean, look at her," she said, her voice trailing off as she gestured vaguely towards Amina. "She probably can't even afford the deductible. I didn't want to waste your time with someone who..." What Dr. Taylor interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "Someone who's black? Someone who you assumed couldn't pay because of how she looks?" Sarah swallowed hard, realizing she had gone too far. "No, doctor, I didn't mean it like that. I just..." "That's exactly how you meant it," Dr. Taylor cut her off. "And let me make this very clear, we don't treat patients based on how they look or what we think they can afford. We treat everyone who walks through that door with the same respect and care, no matter what." Amina stood frozen, shocked by the sudden turn of events. She had been bracing herself for yet another dismissal, another moment where her voice would be silenced, but here was this doctor, standing up for her in a way she hadn't expected. "Sarah," Dr. Taylor continued, his voice icy, "you're done here. Go pack your things and leave. You're fired. This clinic has no place for someone who holds the prejudices you clearly do." Sarah's face went pale, and for a moment she looked as if she might argue. But the stern expression on Dr. Taylor's face told her there was no point. With a huff, she grabbed her bag and stormed out, leaving Amina and Dr. Taylor alone in the waiting room. Dr. Taylor turned to Amina, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry for what just happened. You should have been seen hours ago. Let me take you in right now and have a look at that wrist." Amina nodded, still in a state of shock, but grateful. As Dr. Taylor led her back into the examination room, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like hours, she was no longer invisible. "Thank you," she whispered as they entered the room. Dr. Taylor smiled kindly. "It's the least I can do." Amina Johnson shifted in her chair for what felt like the 100th time. Her wrist throbbed in sync with her pulse, and every movement sent a sharp pain up her arm. She had been sitting in the clinic's waiting area for hours, watching patient after patient come and go, all while being told to just wait a little longer. She had arrived promptly at 2 p.m., and now the clock on the wall read 5:15. Her patience, like her wrist, was nearly broken. Across the room, Sarah Miller, the receptionist, continued her casual chat on the phone. Her laughter echoed through the sterile, white walls of the clinic, grating against Amina's already raw nerves. As Amina watched Sarah lean back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers, she couldn't help but feel the sting of dismissal. She had tried being polite. She had tried explaining that her wrist might be broken. But every time, Sarah's response was the same cold indifference. Amina couldn't ignore what was happening. It was more than just rudeness, it was discrimination. It was the way Sarah's tone shifted whenever she spoke to her, the subtle sneer when she mentioned insurance, and the fact that patients like Mr. Patel had been whisked right into the doctor's office while she was left waiting. Finally, something in Amina snapped. She stood, her body rigid with frustration, and approached the front desk. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but strained. "I've been waiting here since 2 o'clock." Sarah barely looked up from her phone. "I told you you'll be seen when the doctor is ready." "No," Amina said, her tone rising. "I've been here for 3 hours. You've sent in at least 4 patients who came after me." Sarah sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Look, Ma, we're busy. You're just going to have to wait your turn." Amina felt the weight of every minute she had sat in that chair, every glance Sarah had given her, every moment she was ignored while others were prioritized. She wouldn't be dismissed again. "I want to speak to the doctor. Now." At this, Sarah finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, now you want to talk to the doctor? You're going to have to calm down. We don't tolerate yelling here." "I'm not yelling," Amina said, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm asking for the same treatment as everyone else." The door to the back office swung open, and Dr. Taylor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair, stepped out. He glanced between Amina and Sarah, immediately sensing the tension in the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Amina turned to him, relief flooding her features. "I've been waiting since 2 o'clock, and I keep getting told to wait while other patients are seen before me. I'm in pain and I just want to know why." Dr. Taylor frowned and looked at Sarah. "Sarah, is this true? Has Ms. Johnson been waiting for 3 hours?" Sarah shrugged, her demeanor turning defensive. "She came in, but we've been busy. And besides, she probably can't even afford the deductible." Amina's heart pounded as the air in the room seemed to freeze. There it was, the insinuation that had been bubbling under the surface all afternoon. The reason she had been left to sit in pain while others were helped. The assumption that because of the color of her skin, she wasn't worth the time or the care. Dr. Taylor's face hardened, and his voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level. "Sarah, what did you just say?" Sarah shifted in her seat, the confidence in her earlier tone faltering. "I mean, it's not like I'm wrong. Look at her. People like her always have trouble paying. I didn't want to waste your time, Dr. Taylor. You have more important patients." The words hit Amina like a physical blow. She could hardly believe what she was hearing, though deep down part of her wasn't surprised. It was the kind of casual racism she had encountered before, disguised as concern, but dripping with condescension. But now, it was out in the open for all to see. Dr. Taylor's eyes burned with fury, though his voice remained calm. "Sarah, we have a policy at this clinic. We treat every patient with respect, regardless of their financial situation, race, or background. That is not up for debate. Your comment was not only inappropriate, it was discriminatory." Sarah's face reddened, but she kept her chin raised. "I was just thinking about the clinic's resources. I mean, it's not like she can." "Stop," Dr. Taylor interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Sarah blinked, her mouth falling open in shock. "What?" "You heard me," Dr. Taylor said, his voice sharp. "We don't tolerate racism in this clinic. I won't have someone like you treating our patients this way." For a moment, Sarah seemed too stunned to respond. Then her face twisted in anger. "You're going to fire me over her? Over some charity case?" Dr. Taylor's expression didn't waver. "This clinic exists to help people, all people, and if you can't do that without prejudice, you don't belong here. Now, leave before I call security." Sarah stood, her hands trembling with indignation as she gathered her belongings. She cast one last glare at Amina before storming out the door. The sound of it slamming echoed through the quiet clinic. The tension in the room hung thick in the air, but Amina felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be believed, to be defended. The overwhelming emotion of the moment brought tears to her eyes. Dr. Taylor turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry for what just happened. You should never have been treated like that. Let's get you in to see the doctor right away." Amina nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She followed him back to the exam room, the pain in her wrist now secondary to the relief she felt from finally being seen, from finally being acknowledged as worthy of care. As she sat down, Dr. Taylor began examining her wrist with gentle care. "You did the right thing by speaking up," he said quietly. "I want you to know that." Amina met his eyes and nodded, grateful beyond words. The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air as Amina Johnson pushed open the glass doors of the clinic. Her wrist throbbed from the fall she had taken the previous day during a soccer game. She clutched it tightly, hoping that the pain would subside soon. The clinic was modest, with beige walls adorned with posters encouraging healthy habits, but it felt cold and unwelcoming to her. Amina, a black woman in her early 30s, had always prided herself on her resilience, but today, the weight of exhaustion and the dull ache in her wrist wore her down. She approached the reception desk, where a tall, blonde woman named Sarah Miller sat behind the counter, idly scrolling through her phone. Sarah's long nails tapped against the screen as she continued a conversation with someone on her Bluetooth headset. Amina waited for a moment, giving Sarah a chance to finish her call, but the receptionist made no effort to acknowledge her presence. After a few seconds, Amina cleared her throat softly and asked, "Excuse me, I'm here to see a doctor. My wrist is really hurting." Sarah glanced up briefly, barely making eye contact before turning her attention back to her phone. "You'll have to wait like everyone else," she muttered dismissively. She then continued her conversation. "Oh my God, girl, he was so cute. We went to that new Italian place last night. You've got to try it." Amina, taken aback by the cold response, stood there uncertainly, her wrist continuing to throb. She had noticed the other patients sitting in the waiting area, many of whom were white or from other ethnic backgrounds, being called up to the desk and treated with friendly smiles and casual conversations. She couldn't help but feel that something about her presence made Sarah uncomfortable, or perhaps it was deliberate. She glanced over at the waiting room, where Mr. Patel, an older Indian man, had been called back for his appointment immediately upon arrival. Minutes passed, and Amina still hadn't been given any paperwork to fill out. She watched as Sarah continued her personal call, oblivious to the pain in her wrist. Growing increasingly frustrated, Amina spoke up again. "Excuse me, but I've been waiting for a while. Could I please sign in or get my insurance processed?" Sarah sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as if Amina's request was unreasonable. "I'll get to you when I get to you," she snapped, her voice thick with condescension. "Just sit down. I have other patients to deal with." Amina sat down, biting her tongue. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced something like this, but it stung nonetheless. Was it because she was black? The question gnawed at her as she winced in pain, clutching her wrist tighter. Every second that ticked by seemed to magnify the injustice of the situation. An hour passed. Then 2. By the time Amina had been waiting for nearly 3 hours, she was beyond frustrated. Every patient who had come in after her had been seen by the doctor, and she had been left unnoticed, as if she didn't exist. Her patience had worn thin, and the pain in her wrist had only gotten worse. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Amina approached the desk again. This time, Sarah wasn't on the phone, but she looked up with a disinterested expression. "Look, I've been here for over 2 hours, and I'm in serious pain," Amina said, her voice shaking slightly with a mix of anger and desperation. "I need to see a doctor." Sarah glanced at the clock, feigning surprise. "I didn't realize it had been that long," she said flatly. "Do you even have insurance?" Amina's jaw tightened. "Yes, I have insurance. I gave you my card when I first came in." "Oh, right," Sarah mumbled as she rummaged through the papers on her desk. "You know, these things take time. Just because you have insurance doesn't mean you can jump ahead of others. Plus, with your deductible being so high, I'm not even sure you can afford to pay for an X-ray. You know how much those cost, right?" The implication behind Sarah's words wasn't lost on Amina. It wasn't just about the money, it was about assumptions. Assumptions that, because Amina was black, she couldn't possibly have the financial means to cover her medical expenses. The undertones of racism in Sarah's attitude were unmistakable. "Yes, I can afford it," Amina replied, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "Now, could you please get me the help I need?" Before Sarah could respond, the door to the back of the clinic swung open, and Dr. Taylor, a seasoned physician with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, stepped out. He had just finished examining Mr. Patel and was ready for his next patient. "Sarah, is the next patient ready?" Dr. Taylor asked, looking around the waiting room. His eyes landed on Amina, who was standing at the desk, clearly in pain. "How long has this patient been waiting?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before lying. "Oh, she just got here a few minutes ago." "That's not true," Amina interjected, her voice rising. "I've been here for 3 hours. I've watched people who came after me get called in before me." Dr. Taylor's face hardened as he turned back to Sarah. "Is this true?" Sarah stammered. Well, she didn't seem like she was in that much pain. And honestly, with her insurance." Dr. Taylor cut her off sharply. "What does her insurance have to do with it? Our clinic policy is to treat every patient with care and respect, regardless of their background or financial status." Sarah shrugged, her tone defensive. "I didn't think she could pay the deductible. I didn't want her wasting our time." Dr. Taylor's voice was cold with anger. "This is a medical clinic, not a place where we judge people based on their appearance or their financial situation. Your job is to ensure that every patient is seen and treated with dignity, not to make assumptions about them based on their skin color or their income." Sarah's face flushed red. "I didn't mean it like that." But Dr. Taylor wasn't listening anymore. He turned to Amina with a look of genuine concern. "I'm so sorry for the delay, Ms. Johnson. Please follow me, and we'll get that wrist looked at right away." As Dr. Taylor led Amina into the examination room, Sarah stood frozen behind the reception desk, her mind racing. She hadn't expected things to escalate like this. She had always thought of herself as a professional. But now, standing in the spotlight of her own biases, she realized how wrong she had been. Inside the exam room, Dr. Taylor carefully examined Amina's wrist, ordering an X-ray and making sure she was comfortable. "We'll take care of this quickly," he assured her. "You've been through enough today." Amina nodded, grateful for the doctor's kindness. But the sting of what she had experienced lingered. As she watched Dr. Taylor work. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an isolated incident, that Sarah's behavior reflected a broader issue in how people of color were treated in medical settings. A few minutes later, the X-ray results came back. Thankfully, Amina's wrist wasn't broken, just badly sprained. Dr. Taylor wrapped it in a brace and provided her with clear instructions on how to care for it. As he handed her a prescription for pain relief, he looked her in the eye and said, "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come back. And I sincerely apologize for what happened out there. It's not reflective of how we run this clinic." Amina smiled weakly, appreciating his sincerity, but the experience had left a mark on her. "Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I just hope things change for everyone." As Amina left the clinic, Sarah sat at the desk, her eyes downcast, knowing her actions had serious consequences. Dr. Taylor had made it clear that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. It was a lesson Sarah would carry with her long after that day. Later that evening, Dr. Taylor reflected on the day's events. The clinic had always been a place of healing, but today, it had also been a battleground against the prejudice that still pervaded society. As he closed his eyes, he resolved to make sure that what had happened to Amina would never happen again, not in his clinic, and not on his watch.